So thank you so much for joining. It's really a pleasure. And really thank you for the Twitter and LinkedIn support to our movement.
Of course.
Grateful. I will start by introducing you, say a little bit about what the WISE movement is,
sure.
And then the objective of today, and then I have several questions. I hope you're okay with that.
I'm okay with that.
Okay, so I'd like to start by introducing Ms. Anita Bhatia. How do I pronounce it?
You're pronouncing it perfectly.
Good, alhamdulillah. You are the Assistant Secretary General and UN Women's Deputy Executive Director for Resource Management, UN System Coordination, Sustainability and Partnership.
Yes, it's a mouthful.
I know, but you're a woman, multitasked and able. You have been the Assistant Secretary General and UN Women Deputy Executive since 2019. Before joining UN Women, Ms. Bhatia has had a distinguished career at the World Bank Group, serving in various senior leadership and management positions, both at headquarters and in the field. In your various positions and in her various positions, she led teams to deliver significant resources for scaled-up impact. I'll tell you a little bit what we mean, including at the country level, and to craft innovative partnerships to advance development agendas. She has also had significant contributions to the evolving discourse on development finance, which is a major topic. She has led diverse teams, including as a global head of knowledge management, head of business process improvement, and head of change management. So much to know. You've done it all. In addition to Latin America, she has worked in Africa, Europe, Central Asia, and South and East Asia. Ms. Bhatia holds a BA in History from Calcutta University, an MA in Political Science from Yale University, and a Juris Doctor in Law from Georgetown University. I just want to tell you that we share two things. Number one, I was the political science undergrad and the political sociology master's, but I also had the one-year fellowship at Georgetown.
Oh, amazing.
100 years ago. I will not even tell you when. So, you know. Okay, one of the reasons we're having, first of all, we have what we call the WISE Summit, and today's Fireside Chat is really the end of the first day, where we want to talk to a woman who's a leader and what we call also a global shaper of events. And WISE is a movement that is a global movement starting in Ashoka. We've been doing this for some time now, but it's led by the South. So it's interesting because that's how Ashoka works. I am Egyptian, I am in Cairo. I've been with Ashoka for 18 years, but you know, the WISE movement was something I dreamt of, and it is a global movement within Ashoka. And the main goal is really to redefine success from a social entrepreneurship and women's perspective. We've done a survey a couple of years ago, and we found that most of the time, a lot of the impact that women as social entrepreneurs do is not recognized because the ecosystem talks about what they call scale up, which is what we call scale out, replication and franchise, which is important, how many people you reach. But if we're talking about social entrepreneurship and solving social problems, we found out that the majority of our women social entrepreneurs also scale deep and scale up. And scale deep means you change mindsets and patterns of behavior and patterns of action, which goes into the mindset, affects the people now, but also affects the future. And scale up is changing policies and regulations, which does not only affect the population we're working with now, but also the future. So a lot of the women fellows, because we call them fellows, the Ashoka fellows, because they're social entrepreneurs, because they're cause-driven, the causes they tackle are causes where there is a need for change of mindsets. And this as a term for measurement has not been recognized by the ecosystem as a real impact. And also they do a lot of changes in policies and laws. And we're not talking here about gender. We have more than 2,000 Ashoka fellows who are women who work in every field, from agriculture to climate change, to AI, to technology, to education and health, and of course, women empowerment. But we're really talking about women in every field in the social entrepreneurship scene and how they have an impact that we need the world to really recognize. Today, and in this Fireside Chat, we want to explore with you your own trajectory of scaling out, up, and deep in your work, as well as your insights as a leader in the development sector, initiating framework change and women's empowerment. So a lot of the questions will be about how do you see the framework we're introducing? What do you do in your work? You can share with us stories and so forth. Okay. So if you want to say something before I ask you the questions, or do you want me to ask the questions directly?
I think we should go into the questions.
My first question is very Ashoka question.
Okay.
Ashoka.
Okay.
So in Ashoka, we aim to build in everyone a change-making world, maker world. We want everyone to be a change maker, one in which everyone has the space and the power and the opportunity and the encouragement to do social change for good for all the people. And we are very concerned also to start with young people. So we have what we call the Ashoka Young Change Makers.
Yeah.
And we believe that these are the potential and the people who will be the leaders of the future.
Yeah.
Now, we also believe that you cannot have a world with everyone a change maker without having women who are 50% of the population. So that's why the WISE movement. And also women are the mothers, the teachers, the natural leaders who create families and also who empower their children to be change makers. The WISE movement works specifically to uplift women as change makers. Now, given your expertise in the economic empowerment of women, and especially targeting underserved population and the financial inclusion movement, what do you suggest that the development and especially international development sector needs to focus on in order to bring each vision to life? You know, how can the international development sector, the big organization like the UN Women, encourage and bring a world where everyone is a change maker to life, whether it's women or children?
So great question, Iman. And I think we have to start by saying that I think we are at a very critical inflection point in history. And we don't often have inflection points like this. And I've said in previous fora that I think extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. And what I think is the opportunity now is the pandemic has really become a portal to a new world. And if we allow ourselves to imagine that new world, then we can think about how do we construct this new world. But so first we have to be really open to the possibility of seeing things in a very different way. So I think there is space for dreaming in a way that didn't exist before. I mean, some of us have always been dreamers, but never before has the world gone through a year like 2020. You know, fortunately, things like pandemics don't happen all the time. And so because the world was able to slow down and stop and reflect a bit, and also very visibly see the impact of inequality on the world, the impact of not having taken care of our planet properly on the world, it's created more self-awareness and more desire for transformation. So that is a good thing. Then you have to worry about the whole issue of inertia, because it's very easy for old habits and old ways of thinking to come back. And as societies open up and as countries move out of lockdown, you know, before you know it, people will be going back to the old way of living life, and there won't really be a new normal. So what is needed for the new normal and to make everybody a real change maker? First, I think it is recognizing the power of community level work, of local level work. You know, things don't happen in New York. Things happen on the ground. New York is useful as a headquarters for some organizations, including ours. But frankly, even the notion of headquarters to me is outdated, because why is headquarters in New York? You know, we live in a global world. And so every part of the world has something to contribute. And gone are the days when all the lessons were from the north to the south. The lessons are from the south to the north, because the innovation, the young people, the energy, the drive, that is where it is. You know, you look at the demographics in Europe. Europe is, put it bluntly, is old. Asia is young. Africa is young. So the answers are going to come from there. So number one, I would say the primacy of local. And Second, the importance of being able to find mechanisms to harvest local knowledge. Number three, opening the possibility of working in a different way. I think UN Women's Generation Equality Campaign tries to do that, which is to create a space. I don't know if we will be fully successful because the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, and we have to see what results we get. But at least the idea is that we put together governments, civil society, private sector, think tanks, IFIs, others, and we collectively construct some new ways of doing business and bringing about transformation. For us, because we work on the issue of gender equality, it's about the main issues that affect women's lives. So that is great. However, I think one of the things the pandemic has really shown is that governments do have a very important role. Because in the end, when you have a crisis, it's the government that has to deliver the medicines, it has to launch the vaccination, it has to make sure the rules are clear, it has to impose or open lockdown, whatever. So it is even more important than before for organizations like yours and others and ours to influence government, which means a role for organizations like Ashoka, other NGOs to have a really loud voice and to have a seat at the table. So the other issue is really about decision making. I think this issue of leadership and participation in public life is so important, and the numbers are shocking. You know, when you look and you see how many women are parliamentarians worldwide, why do we still have only 25% parliamentarians being women? Why do we still have less than 10% of heads of state as women? Why do we still have less than 10% heads of government women? Why do we have less than 5% of COVID task forces in the world having gender parity? Why do we have only 13 countries in the world that have gender equal cabinets? So when you look at those facts, you say, clearly women are not represented enough. And you know, when the pandemic first broke out, and if you turned on the television, at least here in the US, everybody talking about COVID was a man. And so, you know, you look at that and you say, oh my God, there is something wrong with this picture. And so I think we have to really be in a place in 2021 where equal representation of women in decision making is an absolute given and something we take for granted and not something we are negotiating about. So I think these are some of the elements of what would constitute the right of response at a time like this. And so just to summarize, I would say local government, a seat for women in decision making, pressure for governments to ensure that they are hearing from civil society and women, and very importantly, the ability to imagine a different future and different models of working, different models of society than what we have today.
Anita, this is music to my ears, and actually I think to a lot of Ashokans, because we also believe this is an infection, you know, a very important period of history or era of history where we can imagine a new world, and also where everybody should be included, you know, and I agree with you. And I agree also totally that governments are important, and that of course we need more women. And, you know, and also in Ashoka, 40% of our fellows are women. So in any sector, we have a very large number. However, because of the definition, which was only the replication definition, like how many people have you reached, and the franchising model, a lot of the impact was not being recognized. Thanks to WISE and also to a lot of efforts by Ashoka, internally by women in Ashoka, but also men, we were able to come up with the idea, and I was, you know, of the scaling deep and scaling out, scaling up, where we show the results. Going from there, then, UN Women is an undeniably important institution. I mean, I have a lot of respect for all your work in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia. I've seen a lot of the work. and especially for women's empowerment. In your opinion, how can the social innovation sector better include and empower women social entrepreneurs? In other words, most of the time, the traditional type of development done by a lot of the UN organizations is important and good. And also the other extreme is let us go to private sector. Actually, social entrepreneurs, and especially women social entrepreneurs, are not for business. And they do not franchise, and they do work at the community level. How can you invite the other organizations of the UN and others to be part of this new era?
Yeah, it's a great question because, you know, these models are not very well understood. That is the first point. And I think social entrepreneurship has only in the last, I would say, 15 years really become something that is properly discussed in development circles. And, you know, most of the work there is really about scaling, is how do you take social enterprises to scale? Because they suffer by and large from not having economies of scale and not having the infrastructure, whether it is capital or you know, the right skills, the right policy environment. You know, they don't have the infrastructure to succeed the way big business does. So I think for social enterprises, you do need that right enabling environment for sure, with policies, taxes, as well as incentives for growth. But I also think you need to have more sharing of knowledge and experience of what works. So I would say peer-to-peer learning is really important for driving impact and social innovation. Number two, I think there should be pools of philanthropic capital who do nothing but do funding for innovation at that level so that it can flourish, because out of that will come many things that you can't even imagine. Will be solutions for solving on, you know, access to water, solutions for dealing with certain aspects of climate change, solutions for dealing with certain aspect of women's safety, for instance. So I could see a range of problems being solved through a social innovation approach. But, you know, we are stuck in the same old dialogue that used to take place with respect to SMEs 20 years ago. Give them more financing, the missing middle, give them more working capital, give them more access to technical assistance. And none of those problems have disappeared. But what has been good is that this whole sector has emerged where you have that triple bottom line and where you have that capacity for really coming up with new approaches and new ways of doing things. But very often it dies because it isn't fully supported. So I think both, again, governments, but donors and international development organizations need to systematically think about how do you incorporate social innovation and social entrepreneurship into your strategies, and what is the role of social enterprise in furthering your strategy, whether it's us as UN Women or UNICEF, you know, for children, or UNESCO. I think UN agencies should take on this issue of social entrepreneurship and think through, because the answers will be different for different sectors, but think through what are the possibilities, what are the capacities, what is the opportunity for partnership, and take a true partnership approach rather than a kind of patronizing approach, which is, well, let's just find some money to give to them. But really, how can we partner with them to help them scale? Or if not to scale, then to be an incubation model that others can possibly scale. It doesn't have to be that enterprise itself. Iman, you're on mute.
There is an echo when I leave it, and I totally agree with you. I think there is a need for those organizations to incorporate social innovation and social venture, regardless if it's enterprise for profit or not, into their plans. And maybe we have now already converted you to join us in the movement, right? Okay, my other question is close to my heart. So it's not, it's something where I have been, because it's not very understood, it's not well understood in a lot of the countries in the South. Your extensive career has included senior leadership at the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank. As an expert at the intersection of gender and economic empowerment, what would you categorize as the biggest areas of untapped potential for advancing financial inclusion of women? And let me pause and say that I understand financial inclusion, and I'm sure you do in a certain way, but when it's implemented in many countries in the South, it really is not talking about the financial inclusion we mean. So how can we make it? I mean, my idea is, what is the untapped potential? Let's put it nicely instead of saying anything else.
At the risk of being cliched, I'm going to say digitization. I think the world is now divided into people who, well, I've said this as soon as the pandemic broke out, it's divided into women who have care responsibilities and women who don't, and women who have digital access and women who don't. And I think women who don't have access to, digital goods and services are hugely disadvantaged. And so we have seen what a digital approach to finance can do for women in many parts of the world. And we know that it made life easier for many women, because in a place like India, for instance, the reason that 200 million women were able to get cash transfers during the pandemic is because they have digital IDs and they could be found. Because remember, in our countries, most of the women are in the informal sector. You can't find them. You don't know who they are. You don't have IDs. You don't know where they live, nothing. So if you want to support a large mass of your population, you've got to know who they are and where they are. So the only to leapfrog is through digital. So I think digital is absolutely fundamental for financial inclusion, and its potential has been tapped a little bit, in parts of the South, because the South has actually been much more innovative about this than places in the North. I can do things with, my bank in India that I cannot do in the US, because the US is still behind when it comes to many of these services. And so I think financial inclusion has to have a very strong digital component. And second, I think, there are a lot of initiatives around, right, to get women more access to finance. Women's World Banking, the work done by the Global Banking Alliance, the work done by Queen Maxima of the Netherlands. There is huge push for different ways of engaging women in the financial inclusion movement, if you will. But I also think there is a role outside of these donor-led efforts for homegrown, apps and other ways of engaging women and really democratizing, if you will, access to finance. There has been a lot of democratization of access to finance through digital, but I think it can go even further. And, we saw in a recent event on Wall Street how when individual investors decided to do something, they really made a big impact on Wall Street. And this was not, big investors. These were individuals who decided to basically use their democratic access to the market to do certain things. And so I think this democratization of financial inclusion is really key. Iman, you're on mute again.
Yeah, my access to digitization is not very good. I have 2 or 3 more questions, but we have one of our faithful people who have been attending all our sessions. She wants to ask you one question. So Emilina Corrales, You want to ask the question now or you lose your time? Emelina, okay, ask now. Okay. You can post it in the chat, Emelina, if you want. I would like to know, okay, what? One of my dreams, until she answers right, is to go to India. I've gone to so many countries in the world, I've never been in India.
You cannot claim to have lived a full life on this earth without going to India. My grandfather used to say that you cannot live a full life on earth if you have not been to Egypt. And I'm going to turn it around and say you can't do that if you haven't been to India, because he saw Egypt late in his life and he said, save it for the end because it's so fantastic that everything else will disappoint. So save it towards the end. But I mean, yeah.
Well, I will do it. Okay, so her question is, how can we reduce the gap that has been constructed during COVID pandemic in gender inequality? You know,
so
there has been...
I could talk about this for a long time, but let me say a few things. First and foremost, I think this has to be recognized as a problem that goes beyond the women's movement, and it goes beyond those who already work in gender. This is to be recognized as an issue of public policy. And that means that all fiscal stimulus packages that governments are administering right now actually have to include a focus on gender and women at the center of recovery and reform packages. So that's really important. That's number one. Number two, there are a few issues that everyone needs to work on. The first is the care economy, because the burden of care borne by women before the pandemic was already 3 times that borne by men, and it's only gotten worse during the pandemic. So how do you solve for that? You have to solve for that by making sure that public policy is paying attention to subsidies for care, childcare credits, childcare facilities, investments in schools, extra teachers so that kids can go back to school, all of that. All of that has an impact on the care economy. Then I think it's really important for there to be paid attention to this issue of violence against women, because the amount of violence against women that went up during the pandemic is just unacceptable. We need to call this a public health issue. So just the way we are dealing with the pandemic and vaccinations, let's start to talk about violence against women as a public health issue. And that needs to be solved by governments, because too often violence is considered a family issue, a personal issue. It's not. It's actually a matter of public policy, because only then can you get enough investment into this. Only then can you get enough attention to the impact it's having on the economy. And, it has to shift from the realm of being just a moral issue to an issue that is impacting the kind of society and economy you live in. So that's a second thing. And the third is we have to find ways to get women back to work, because what is happening in the pandemic and the kind of reopening phase is that female labor force participation is dropping and women are not going back to work in the same way because they have the care burden. So, that care burden impact on women's labor force participation is so crucial that we have to make special efforts. That means employers have to be more flexible. That means employers have to provide care facilities. It means we have to change the notion of what constitutes a work day. It's no longer 8 to 5 or 9 to 6 or whatever it is. It's when your kid is not doing homework and you can work. That's what work days have to become. And we have to have a radical rethinking, which the pandemic has already forced many of us to do, of how you get work done. So the future of work has to be female friendly. And that means you may not have to go back to the office ever. Or if you do go back, maybe you only go back a few days a week so that you can live a more normal, balanced and healthy life,
I mean, this is fascinating. And I love the idea that it is not about gender, it's a public policy issue. Because it is. I always say a lot of what we do, including reproducing kids who are going to be the leaders of the future. This is not personal, this is a public, this is not a private matter, it's a public matter. You know, I always believe our reproductive role is public. We are reproducing the society, and people should, and the governments and the world should understand it's a public service, actually, we're doing that. But I think what you said is excellent, and I agree totally with it, and I think it goes back to all our feminist beliefs. But how are we going to do this, Anita? I mean, I was going to ask you another question, which I will, but all what you said is great, but how? Like, what is the first step to do that? Because this is great advice. Where do we start, and how can we start?
So, you know, it's not as difficult as it may sound. The first is all governments have the option to do gender responsive budgets. So as they design their budgets, they can say we are going to allocate resources to this. It means making difficult decisions about what you spend on and making those trade-offs. One of the things I have started to say is it's really important to think about why do we need to spend as much as we do on military expenditure and defense expenditure, and instead take some of that money and put it to social sectors and spend it on women. Reallocate that, because look, all governments have suffered as a result of the pandemic. For everybody, the pie has shrunk. So with a shrunk pie, you know, it's no different from a household decision. When you have less money, you decide, am I going out? Am I, you know, what am I spending on? Same thing. You have less money, you decide, am I going to spend the same amount on defense? Maybe not. And I put that towards health, towards education, towards things that makes people's lives better. You know, I remain unconvinced that most governments need as much to spend as much as they do on defense. And, you know, and one of the learnings from the pandemic was that the failure to prepare for the pandemic and the failure to invest in public health actually gave you a new notion of what is security. How are you secure when you cannot, you know, you may be secure by building bombs and rockets, but what are bombs and rockets going to do for you when you have a public health crisis? So security has a whole different meaning today. And so we need to invest in that kind of security, not in the bombs and rocket security. And so the first point is gender responsive budgeting. The second is, look, the stimulus package in the US actually has a lot of really interesting aspects to it, which are addressing this issue of the child care burden, of the incentives to go back to school, the investments in schooling and extra teachers. So very important lessons there that can be copied. Number three, governments have to be willing to spend. This is not a time to say we're not spending because we're worried about deficits. This is a time to spend. And yes, a little bit you are passing on the burden to future generations, but this is actually a time to invest in infrastructure to build the society back. Because if you skimp on expenditure now, it will have long-term consequences. So it's doable, but it's a question of political will and of advocacy to ensure that the spend is on the right things.
I am so impressed with your answers, and they're just on the topic, you know. Before, I mean, there is a question I also want to ask you. It's a little bit more personal, but I have to. So in your opinion, and after your long experience and expertise in the international development in different places, what is the impact achievement you are most proud of? Like, whatever it was, you can mention one or two stories, but like, what is it that you're most proud of? And it can be personal and professional. You can tell us two stories.
Okay. I would say professionally, one of the most rewarding times in my life was probably when I was working as an advisor to the government of Bolivia, because it was, you know, one of the poorest countries in Latin America, really keen to see more investment, really keen to see more growth. And it was the worst paid job that I've ever had. And but in some ways the most satisfying, because you could really see firsthand how the work that we were doing to write laws and to change policies was having a direct impact on people's lives and ultimately on the country, because at that time Bolivia was engaged in negotiating a free trade agreement with the US, and if it had lost that negotiation, then it would not have been able to export as much. Many jobs would have been lost. Many people's lives would have been destroyed. So I felt very happy about the contribution I was able to make to save that, you know. So I think that's one story that I can share about what makes me happy. I mean, there are many, but this is one. In terms of personal, I would say, hey, I know, for my 50th birthday, I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro with my daughter. I was very proud of that.
For me, is like, yeah, to climb anything. And how old is your daughter?
Well, she's now 29, but you know, she was a bit younger then, and it was, you know, it's not a technical climb, so it wasn't as difficult as it sounds. But still, I think getting up to 14,000 feet or 19,000 feet, yeah, was felt like a great accomplishment. But we still have to do base camp Everest, so that's next.
Okay, I will, you know, you'll be my role model when you do it. I will not even pretend that I can even think of doing it, but I will pray for you. Okay, before we end, I would like you to think a little bit as a woman leader, as a lot of young people, but also, you know, different social entrepreneurs are listening to us, and they will listen because this is recorded and will be publicized also. Mm-hmm. What would you give? What advice would you give? And to different types of women, to the young girls who are the young change makers, to social entrepreneurs, to women who are mothers. I mean, think of each one. What advice would you give each one? And to women who want to be leaders like you?
Well, first, I think it's very important to really have confidence in yourself and to practice if you are nervous about anything. I'm a big believer in practice makes perfect. And so if you're a businesswoman who's pitching to get a loan or to do something difficult, right? You actually have to practice. So if you're planning to have an important conversation with somebody, practice that conversation so that when you have it, you've had it before and you can do it well. A lot of people don't actually practice for really important things in life. And I, to this day, and I'm, you know, old, practice about certain things if I think they're really important. And so it's another way of saying preparation and hard work. There is really no substitute for that. Again, a confidence is very important, so to have the faith in yourself, in your ideas. Number three, I would say it's really important not to be afraid to speak up. And very often women have difficulty finding their voice, especially in environments which are male dominated. But I would say it's very important to be able to speak. And number four, I would say it's really important to also be able to listen and to really listen to people with respect and with empathy, because I think being able to do that, you know, it's much more important really to listen than it is to speak. So I would say these would be some tips. And then, you know, having the courage of your convictions is really important, because there will be times when you will fail and it will be very difficult going, and you will wonder why you were doing a certain thing and how are you going to get through a particularly bad phase. But you also have to really have faith and say the universe has good things in store, you know, and trust the universe a little bit that things will work out, even if you have bumps along the way.
I really, really like your answers. And I'm not easy to be pleased, you know, so I really am very impressed. And we don't have a lot of time, but I want you I want your own insight, like in one sentence, of what you think of what we're trying to do in WISE, to redefine success so that we can recognize women's impact in the social entrepreneurship sense, to accept and recognize scale deep, which is mindsets as a real impact, changing of mindsets, scale up, when you change a policy, you affect many people today and the future, and of course, scale out, but not just the scale of numbers. What do you think of this framework? Give us a piece of advice so that we end up with your advice and your wisdom.
I would say thinking about this framework of scaling deep, you know, versus just scaling up or scaling out, as you were putting it, really demonstrates the focus on knowledge and on experience. So I think in terms of that framework, I would say the single biggest thing that you can do to be successful is to find good examples of where scaling deep has really worked, and then invest a lot of effort in sharing those good practices, because nothing breeds success like success. And you need those positive examples to motivate. Hope and is a very powerful motivator. So if you can show people how it was done through that scaling deep, you will immediately get resonance.
You made me even happier, because we part of WISE is a storytelling initiative of 200 women, and our colleague Audrey is interviewing a lot of our fellows across the world, east, south, northwest, and we are highlighting the scaling deep of it, in ways that people will understand. And we are going to launch by the end of this year, the WISE website, where all these stories will be nicely portrayed. So you made me even happier now. So thank you, Anita, so much for this time. The 45 minutes went like this, and I hope we meet in person in India and Egypt.
That would be great. Please follow me on Twitter if you are not already following me.
I did. I followed you.
Listening.
Yes.
And let us remain in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.